about your work. Yeah?
Yeah.
I think in order to, the first question I have for you is, it takes me back to thinking about seeing this work for the first time. So I remember we're in lockdown. My phone is sort of my only access to art at that time.
Right.
And I start seeing these intense, vibrating, just beautiful images in my hand, right? And on Instagram. And now, as I'm walking through the space and looking at them, they are intense in a variety of other ways, right? And so I think it's interesting to me that these images spoke so beautifully and intensely in this time when we were all isolated. And I was thinking a lot about your practice and process. So I'm wondering if you can describe for us what it was like to make these pieces.
It was a relief, I would say. I think, of course, like the pandemic hit everyone differently, but I think it hit them in an intense way. Everyone's intensity was different in terms of like the reaction to it. So for me, I feel like there was a lot of isolation for me during the pandemic. Just going through my own personal like things, own personal journey. And I feel like these were just like nice ways of expressing that, or like simpler ways of expressing it. And for me, how they started was just simply like, I've always been someone who keeps leftovers of papers. Like my background's in printmaking, so there's always those leftover like sheets, like on like like you cut down your paper and there's always like those long strips usually, and I always keep them. I've always been like that. And so I realized like I have all these leftover strips of like paper, let me start something, and then it just like turned into this weekly thing. And maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but sometimes I get really excited for class to end so I can just go back and draw and paint them. And so for me, like the way they started was a little bit too out of like happenstance, because when I first moved here is really when they started, like these smaller pieces. Yeah, because like, again, coming from a print background, not having access to a print shop, you're like, what do I do in the meantime? So like you go to the thing that's like most accessible to you. And so this is what I had, and then like, it started off pretty slow, and then once the pandemic hit, it just really started to like kick into higher gear. So just kind of just seeing like where they started, and like 1 became 2, 2 became 4, so on and so forth. It just started doubling up, and I was like, the more I saw, like the more I like hung them up, the more I was thinking to myself like, I'll just keep going. And there was no like predetermined design. It was just like, let me just draw this grid, let me get my stencils and go from there. And what is the grid trying to tell me today? It's pretty much how I like approach them too.
Interesting. So with each of these pieces, you started with the grid.
Yeah.
And then saw where it took you.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's something about like, I understand too with like the grid, it's infinite but limited at the same time. Like the combination of like shape and pattern and design is like infinite, but also I understand the limitations in terms of like how refined it is, at least for me. Like it sometimes, I do recognize that like when I work with the grid, I work in a very sort of tedious, meticulous way. I'm not loose, I'm not gestural, and it kind of limits me in that capacity. So the designs are like endless, but understanding the way in which my body works with these is like pretty limited. Like I can't get out of it, though I want to stay in it, but it's like this dual relationship almost.
Is that something that attracts you to the grid then? Is it that kind of that structure within which you can play?
Yeah,
or?
I would definitely say that, especially coming from like a background where I didn't have much structure. Like when I went into college, there was like no structure whatsoever. I was the first one to go, and I was like, I have zero blueprint, so I'm just like flailing around like wacky waitable, waiting like inflatable arm guy over here. and racking up debt as I do so. But so for me, I feel like the grid is its own way of like giving me some form of structure within my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I also look at the grid as like a language. And I won't forget too, like how my dad would sometimes say like he'd ask me something and I'd be like, huh? I didn't understand. He's like, in Arabic he'd be like, "Ma btafham ma'ani wala Inglese," which means like she doesn't understand English or Arabic. I'm like, you know what? Facts, but but like for me, I was like, yeah, I don't understand much English, I don't understand much Arabic, but I do understand the grid, and I feel like that's the language that like I'm like always referring back to. Like that's the language that I understand the world around me.
I want to come back to what you were saying about kind of flailing around in college, and because I do want to ask then how you chose this path and moved into the space of making visual art, right?
Yeah.
But what you're saying about the grid is so fascinating because of course I know we talked about this already, but when I first came into this space, I was really kind of very much aware of my own colonized mind. I started to think about all of these associations to European modernism. We were talking about like the Bauhaus and Joseph Albers and Annie Albers, and then we were also in this space with another curator, Natasha Jimwala, who started bringing up a lot of other artists that she was connecting to this work. Rashid Arain is the one who sticks out in my mind the most, but I know there were others. And so I'm wondering if you can, kind of building on that idea of the grid, speak a little bit about some of the associations that we could have with this work that's not only centering a Western modernist narrative. And some of that may also be, part of the inspiration for this work, but complicate it for us a little bit.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm not gonna deny that there's always gonna be like that Western modernist influence. That's kind of how I understood art when I was younger. So in high school, I'll go even a little bit further to that. Like my favorite form of art was like the constructivist movement and like the modernist movement. Like I loved Rodchenko. I loved the idea of like art for the proletariat type of thing. And just like the way in which like art was like composed in that fashion. It's very geometric, very bold, like quick and to the point with its message. So I know that it was always there. And then as I've gotten older, like I'll always have people like Annie Albers, Joseph as well, and especially Agnes Martin within like the lexicon of like my work. And like you said too, like they're not the only ones. There are other artists as well. Like one that always stands out to me is Ahmed Menehi, like who was a Moroccan artist who focused a lot on like abstract expressionism too. And it just kind of made me think as well. Well, they must have gotten it from somewhere, but like the grid was never there like that. Like the West was never like the area where like the grid was located. For me, I feel like the grid is ancestral. I can trace it as far back into like the Islamic Empire, like the formation of architecture, the formation of pattern. And for me, like that's how I connected back to like sort of talking to that like history within like Islamic artwork and architecture. I also like to see it like it's continuing like a language too, like visual decadence in a sense. Yeah, like I look at the work in which like my people are known for, and I think to myself like, wow, my brain was really colonized even within like as an art student in undergrad and grad school. And I think too that comes to the colonization of how we view Islamic art too, how we always just reduce it to quote unquote decorative. So we feel like, oh, if it's just decorative, it must not have meaning, which is the furthest thing from the truth, right? So it took me a long time to undo that notion that the work from like from like the 700s onto like the 1400s, even further today into the contemporary world, like no, that work was speaking of a language of like transcendence. It was speaking to like a higher power, it was connecting itself to its creator. I mean, if we look even to like the Persian rugs, how most, if not all of it, is perfect except for like that little square that's like intentionally imperfect as a way to like for the human to remind themselves they're not God, therefore we cannot make anything perfect. Like that is a way in which you speak as like a reminder of like, hi Sky Daddy, you created me, awesome. I am not a religious scholar or anything, so please don't come for me, any YouTube religious scholars, I don't need this. But like, it really is that, there is like the language of the divine within the grid, and for me, like that is always gonna be connected, and I always now see myself, because there was that question of like, am I still in that sort of framework of Islamic art, because like the work I made prior to was definitely in that realm, but looking at it now, it took a while, but I was like, no, I definitely like still am, if like the grid has continued throughout, and the way in which like you formulate pattern and think about structuring color, like that language was passed on. Now now I'm bringing it out in just a different format.
I love the fact that you linked back to your earlier work as well, because that was a question that I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
You know, I first came to your work through some of your earlier work where you have this sort of careful attention to the written word, to sort of the beauty of calligraphy, that tradition, and also this careful craftsmanship. Those books are just so carefully constructed, and they also seem very different, just maybe on the surface, when kind of looking at them in relation to this work. So it sounds like you're already explaining some of the connections. Can you dig into that a little bit further?
Yeah, I think the one thing, I'm gonna be very honest, like I really wanted to continue that series, but the simple answer is like, I got bored. Like it happens, like you just get bored with what you're making. And I think too, like, context changed as well. Like I'm in a different sort of environment altogether versus the environment that I was in that helped sort of create the work. I think being in community amongst other people from like Southwest Asia and North Africa, them seeing the work, them reacting to the work, like friends of mine and acquaintances who see the work, like it hit them in a really like beautiful way that I didn't expect. And I feel like in part, like I stepped away from that work because I stepped away from like my people in a sense. Like I was like, who am I talking to now? And it's like that, like sort of that spiraling, that like that post-grad spiral of like, okay, I made the work, but is it good? Someone tell me that the work is good. I don't know anymore. Like I'll post it on the internet, get my likes, you know? So I think like that, and like just recognizing, I still love like this idea of like that repetition, and again, like that's still connected in that sense, but I don't know, I just realized like there was a shift that happened within me that was just like, give this a rest for now. Because I also recognized too, it was starting to look, it was coming to a point where I was like, oh, this is starting to look the same. And there, like, it was like limiting me in terms of variety. And whereas like this work, I feel like there's more potential today.
I love that. So it sounds like you're saying that you're still pursuing similar questions. You're still interested in kind of like exploring, concepts like the decorative and the grid, and deconstructing them in some way, or challenging assumptions that people might have about. I mean, decorative is very famously a bad word,
right? Like craft.
In some contexts, yeah, exactly. But you're pursuing those questions with a different structure and a different sort of focus,
right?
In color, in craft as well, but using sort of different tools.
Absolutely. And I think too, like, I think my relationship to like religion and faith shifted dramatically, like since being here. I think that's like another big part as to why I just like stepped away from that work as well. It's like I'm like missing the connection now, and so like I look at the work now as it still has that quality that's like seeking that like sort of divine connection through the grid. But I think now I recognize, like, in order to connect to that, you gotta connect back to yourself and what you want. And there's this other thing too within grad school that kind of makes you feel this way. It's not said out loud. I definitely felt like while I was in grad school making that work, I enjoyed making it, but I also felt like there was like a slight expectation to make it because I'm talking about language, because it's coming from like an Islamic and Arab reference, that this is what is expected of me. It was never said, but you still feel that pressure nonetheless. And so I just went along a way too that like appeased others. Like it gave me joy, but I also recognized like, oh, it's giving joy to others. But now I had to tell myself like, okay, that story, we can put that chapter aside. Because now I feel like this relationship that I have to like something higher, like I said, has like shifted dramatically. Yeah, I can't go back to that work and think that I have a connection when I don't.
It's interesting because then that maybe suggests that this work is more connected to who you are, or it's connected to who you are in different ways than the earlier work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with this work now, I think it's the work that I always wanted to do, and I didn't even know it. I've always like had an inclination, like even when I was younger, to drawing patterns and playing with color. And I think like coming into like graduate school, like my palette toned down like significantly, and then I toned it back up when I came here. And I realized like, oh, this is like the thing that I've been like seeking, is like just like the happiness and like the sake, like making art for art's sake as well. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, the title, and I think it kind of relates to some of what you're saying, because there is this, sometimes I've heard assumptions that the idea of regressing is a negative thing, an unhealthy thing, and when I'm in this space and looking at this work, I feel so much joy.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of assuming that the artist also in the process of making felt that. So tell us a little bit about the title.
Yeah.
Where that comes from, how you're kind of also reclaiming the idea of regression.
Yeah. I would like to thank, if she's watching this, I'd like to thank my friend Alana for that. When I first moved here, I lived with my friend, and we would talk about things that were kind of taken away from us as children, and even into like our teenage years, just simply because of being in like a female body or a female presenting body, expectations that are put on you, and having to be an adult before everyone else. Like that whole thing of like, oh, it takes boys longer to mature faster than girls. It's like, no, you just let them do that, They can mature at the same rate, I swear. I promise you they can do that, just believe me. But I think this is a lot of what that work is about, is thinking about that lost voice that like I never really got to express. And coming from like a house full of like boys, like, and being the only girl, I was like, where is my voice in all of this? I don't really see it anymore. And to this day, I still don't really see it, but that's okay. But I think this is like the voice that's been wanting to like call out for a really long time. And I'm like, okay, I'm listening, I swear. I'm paying attention this time,
I love that. So,
yeah.
I mean, do you think that, because it takes time and maybe even a long time to be able to pay attention like that, do you think that your ability to do that was how was it impacted by all of the alone time that we had in the early, pandemic?
Yeah.
And then I guess the second part of that question is, what are you doing now that we're in sort of the later stages of the pandemic to still hold on to that, if you want to?
Yeah. I think like having that alone time, I don't think the work would have existed without like the pandemic, quite frankly. I think like the time spent doing this was not only vital for me like artistically, but just as like a human being. Like there were a lot of like pieces of shattered glass that I didn't know that were on the floor, and I had to figure out a way to pick it up. And I think like this is also talking about that in some sense too. Is like, oh, I neglected this like younger self for so many years for the sake of like appeasement, and in the end it didn't matter because it's never gonna be enough. And so like for me, I needed these years to like recognize like, what do I value? You know? Like not what other people value, and that's been like put onto me, you know? What are my expectations? What are my values? What am I looking for? And I think having that alone time allowed me to recognize like, in order to find those things, I gotta like make up for like that lost time of that younger self who never got the chance to really like be themselves. And now I kind of like do like kind of small silly things, like whenever a song comes on that I like listened to in high school, I didn't have a car, so every time it comes on I just blare it and I'm just like screaming it like as I'm driving. Like those are ways in which I like tap back in, and I'm like, okay, you're still there, awesome, cool. Little emo Zeinab is still there somewhere, just a Bruin, you know. And I think now, like post-pandemic, I still try to find those ways to do it. I think I'm like, what the thing is actually, I was like, I'm incredibly grateful for the pandemic. I know it wreaked havoc and it did it to everyone, but like, yeah, I don't, the way in which I was before the pandemic, I don't think I can ever go back to. Whether it's in like my artistic like pursuits, or like just like my own personal life, like I don't think there's like a way to go back, at least to like that self that like ignored themselves, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And I think it also kind of illuminates how that title is it has an apologetic word in it, but it's really more of a
Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, I would, as a kid, like, there were so many, I'm used to be alone time too, because, like, I remember as a kid too, just, like, my favorite thing was just being in my basement and watching TV, like, coming from, like, a first generation background, like, and having no framework of, like, what America is. Pop culture is, like, America to me. Like, TV really was my mom and dad. Like, it taught me so much. And so, like, for me, this is also an ode to, like, my love for pop culture, like, my love for, like, the ridiculous, for, like, the out of this world, and, like, my love for, like, the idea of, like, quote-unquote reality, you know, like, this kind of play on, like, what is real, what isn't. And for me, it's, like, when I work on these drawings, it's almost like I'm building another world, I'm escaping into another world by using color and shape to, like, get there. And so, for me, like, the alone time, I'm used to it, but like to do it like with no one around me, with like complete privacy and having like autonomy over my time, I mean, that's a luxury.
I mean, it brings me to another question that is maybe a little more practical, and maybe not as sort of poetic as where you're going with these forms and spaces and colors taking you to other worlds. But I'm thinking about how much you do. You know, you're a faculty member, you're now teaching back on campus, you're also a leader in the art department at Bowling Community College right now, you're a chair. I think that this opening happened just shortly after you returned from the United Arab Emirates, installing another show.
Yeah.
So you have all of these things that you're balancing.
Right.
If you're thinking about talking to, say, someone who's just about to graduate, or they're going to graduate this year, and they're moving out into the world to continue their work, how are you able to still find that time for yourself, which very clearly this show is evidence of how important that time is.
Yeah.
How do you continue to center your studio practice and yourself?
Sacrifice. Like, I know there are, these last 3 years too, like, there were so many things I wanted to go out and see in Portland, right? Like, really get to know the land, and that was kind of, again, like time taken away to like focus on this. And for me, like, I'm still like sacrificing that time. And I think like the driving factor too is like, I just know that somewhere in my gut I'm onto something, and that drive is the thing that like reminds me like this is more important and bigger than you. Like, it's bigger than myself, it's bigger than making the work. Like, there's something here that I'm like trying to tap into that like I've been trying to for so long. It's like the sacrifice of time, like being with friends or even like going out, reminds me like this, like it's worth it. I mean, then again, I grew up with like hermit tendencies, so like for those of you that are social, maybe you don't want my advice. Like, just do nothing; it'll be great. Sit for 7 hours, watch The Real Housewives of Jersey, and just paint your heart out, kids. If only. But yeah, I truly feel like that drive of knowing like there's something bigger and beyond me out there that's telling me to keep making this work is the thing that like reminds me to like center my time wisely. And I'm also someone who like can't work without like scheduling things. Like, this is what I'm gonna do for today or for the week. I don't go by the minute or anything like that, but I think that also helps me out. I'm like this close to going by the minute, by the way, like seconds away. No, if it gets to that point, call my therapist. It's not okay. But yeah, I just have to force myself to like find that time. And honestly, I do get upset when I'm like, dang, I had that whole day, and then this thing like kind of thwarted it. Like, I feel it. I was like, it makes me sad. Like, everyone's like, how's your weekend? I'm like, I can't say I'm sad because I never got to paint. Like, it's so silly. I didn't get to paint today. I'm mad about it. So yeah, it's just a matter of like how, I don't want to say how much do you want this, because I don't want to fall into like that dog-eat-dog capitalist garbage within the art world. It's like, how much is that, like, I would say, reframe it more along the lines of like, how much is that voice talking to you? Yeah.
And it sounds like this, I mean, what it seems like what you're saying is that this is only the beginning. What you've begun to explore here, there's more. There's,
I'm so sorry that there is more. Oh gosh, no.
I feel like that's absolutely something not to apologize for, because this is really, I mean, there's some deep beauty that you brought out here. And I know we were talking about how beautiful is also a word that you're not supposed to use. What was the other word? Succulent, I think.
That was, Avantika. Yeah. That one is a really great word. I love that word. I'm gonna stick to that one.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, you know, I know you were already talking about kind of the grid as a starting point, and then you mentioned sort of these works kind of taking you to other places, or being, and I'm thinking, you know, there's specific pieces when I stand in front of them, and you know, my eyes start to vibrate a little bit, and there's really this almost like a visceral reaction that I have to some of the pieces in the series. What are you? I understand the work is entirely for you, but also we engage with it too. So Absolutely. What are you hoping that that we as viewers get from engaging with this series?
I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but I hope you get joy and care out of this. Like, I say care too because like all of this really is a labor of love. I don't necessarily treat any of these pieces differently, like based off of size or anything like that. Like, there is like just that labor of love put into each piece. There really is like just like a filling up of like my cup, if that makes sense. Like when it's done, I'm just like, I'm satisfied with this. I hope you get like visual satisfaction out of this. Yeah, joy, care, and visual satisfaction.
I love that
Yes.
so much. I mean, because there's certainly something that feels really satisfying about a lot of these pieces.
Yeah.
I wonder how you feel about maybe allowing the audience to ask some questions. If anyone has any questions, or if you want us to. I see someone raising their hand.
Yeah. So, I'm just wondering about the physicality of the making and how that maybe feeds that care, or other things that come to mind about that.
You ever hear about the body keeping the score? Because that's literally what this is too. No, but I know that like over time, like the work that I've made has taken a physical toll on me. Like, I don't know if like you would be able to see that, but like for me personally, like I know that for like the amount of time I put into it, like my hands are starting to feel it, my eyes are feeling it, my back is definitely feeling it. And there's something within me that's like, yeah, you should probably ignore that and just keep going. And I'm like, you really should not be doing this. Just go to a doctor, please. But like, I don't know what it is, like, that keeps me coming back, even though I know that like, my body is like, wanting rest. But I think now that this body of work is over, I've intentionally went out of my way to like, stop making. Once this work was up, I was like, okay, let's like, take a breather, like, let my hand finally like, calm down, let my back like, just rest, and let my eyes just like get a reset. So I think like this body of work taught me like you shouldn't have to go that hard for your work. Like rest is really important. And I always feel like I am someone who's like, I feel really young, but my body's like, no, you're not. You're really not though. So I think that's what always just like I'm in conflict with all the time. It's like I know I have the energy, but like does my body really have that energy? So I think now like I'm learning the lesson of like you should really take that break. Like really listen to your body, like tap into it and just let it take a break. Yeah. Go eat a sandwich, please. Your blood sugar is dropping.
I was going to ask about, because I know you, and this is related to the question just asked in your reply to it.
Yeah.
Because I know you've also recently begun to work on a larger scale. I'm thinking about the mural you did for Open Signal, and then this piece as well. And so I was going to ask about kind of the differences between working on this, a much larger surface and the small, careful attention that you gave to the smaller pieces. And I wasn't thinking as much about the physical toll that those smaller pieces might take.
Yeah.
But can you speak a little bit about the experience of going larger? And if you're interested in continuing to explore that direction as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in going bigger, but I think my heart always like yearns for staying small. I don't think I will ever reach a level of intimacy that a smaller piece gives me, and I think that's what always reels me back in is like that delicate nature, that softness that comes with working with a smaller piece. And I'm always in conflict with that too. Like, we always think bigger is better, bigger is what gets the attention, bigger is what catapults you to another level, but like, for me, I don't believe that anymore. And sometimes I feel that pressure of like, you should just go big. Why aren't you going bigger? Like, this is wasting your time. It's like, but that intimacy, that softness, that time that allows me to just like, be in my body only exists when I'm working smaller. So, yeah, I think like, yeah, I'd love to work big, but I think I'm always gonna be like leaning back on working small. And even like I'm thinking about the future of like working with books again. So bringing like that craft into this work, like how would that translate? And I'm really excited to think about that as like, what do they look like now as objects that are dimensional rather than like objects that like flat. So
That's really exciting to think about, particularly considering what you said about this body being, really where you're starting to claim a language for yourself. That's
Right.
not what you're assuming other people want you to make. That's really interesting. And I also like the idea of challenging sort of the way that monumentality is kind of privileged in American art context or U.S. art context.
Yeah.
I think that's really.
There was a moment too, like where I looked at these as like self-portraits as well, for a brief moment, and I thought about the scale, and I asked myself, I was like, is this how small you think of yourself? Like when I saw these as like a negative, and I was like, and at first, like that was a really jarring question that like popped into my head, but the more I thought about it, I was like, no, but this is, this is like the tenderness and love that I deserve, because of the way I approach the work with that, like that softness, that tenderness, that I did not get, in my younger years. And I feel like that's also a way of like making up for myself too, is like teaching myself what love and tenderness is through like the language of art, and like giving that back to my younger self.
That's so beautiful. I mean, really, I know that dialogue around the inner child is something that so many people find cliche, but I think the way you're talking about it is really, it's empowering, honestly. And also, because I'm looking at all of these very small and really complex and intense pieces behind you, and thinking about you viewing those pieces as engagements with the self and self-portraits even, and then thinking of the complexity of yourself. If this is, the multiple identities that live inside of you are, I don't know if you were thinking of that as you were making all these different images, or if I'm just kind of reading that into these images now that you said that you were kind of engaging with them as self-portraits. I'm thinking about intersectionality.
Yeah. I think some of them definitely felt that more so at the start of it. I still see them as that, but I also I like that you bring up like the nuance and complexity of like the human being, because like I feel like even as a kid, I always knew like something was up, something was not necessarily off, I would say, but like I knew that I was like a difficult kid for my parents. Don't say anything. If you know me, don't know. But no, I just like in terms of like being a cycle breaker, I didn't realize I was a cycle breaker until I moved here. And so I always was like the child that challenged a lot for my mom, like asking questions that she herself was just not ready to like have asked. I think like for her, when she got a daughter after having like 3 and like 4th boy with my twin brother, and she got a daughter, she's like, finally a relief, someone who will listen to me and like just like do as I say. And so for me, like I come in like from the jump, I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing that. Why do I have to do it and someone else isn't? And she just like she would get so mad at me. And I think too, like I was a really sensitive and emotional kid, and I look back at my younger self too in my 20s, who like rejected so much of that like sensitivity and like to be tough and like not cry, and now like my older self is like, no, actually we're gonna cry at that commercial because that was really well done, But I say this because I'm also trying to capture like that complexity and nuance that was my younger self, that was gaslit into thinking like you're just like this one note, or like you're just young, or like you're just too emotional or too sensitive or whatever, you're overreacting. And it's like, no, I was like really asking these questions because I just want my justice as a kid, So I definitely feel like those complexities and nuances are translated in some way from like my younger self and my current self into these pieces.
That's beautiful. So pushing against what the art world might want to be, pushing against what your grad program wanted to be, pushing against
like familial expectations.
Yeah. I love that. And then also challenging assumptions that it's not okay to cry.
Yeah.
That it's, you know, that emotionality is weak.
Yeah. And I think about that with like the color pink too, like a color that like we like all love regardless of gender. And then as you get older, like I would hear it too, it's like pink is overrated, like it's for little kids or something like that. And I think pink is like also like the through line as well throughout these pieces is like pink finds its way in some capacity. There's so much of it. And for me, I was like, oh yeah, pink is like, that's the kid. Like that's the kid that's like tapping in, you know? Yeah. Like reclaiming pink as well is like a big thing for me too. Like, and not just reducing it to like a gender or anything like that. Because while I was making this work too, kind of just recognizing, oh, this work is also like going in and out of itself, like transitioning in and out. And I definitely felt like with that process of while making this work, I was thinking a lot about like gender and gender expectations and like kind of breaking out of like what is expected and breaking into like who I am as someone who's much more fluid than what was offered. And then breaking away from like gender conventions and expectations and acknowledging like, oh, I didn't consent to these expectations. Like, they were just like forced onto me. I'm gonna let them go. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I'm aware also that we didn't gather more questions from
Please
the audience.
ask questions.
So maybe we can turn back out again and ask are there other questions that y'all have for Zeinab about this body of work? Yeah.
I was just gonna kind of go off of what you were saying about wanting, or like what you want other people to get out of it. Is it being visually satisfying and it being visually pleasing, and what is so satisfying to me, or like some of what is so satisfying to me is how there's endless movement in all of your pieces, and I am just curious like what if there's like how you relate to that, or if you do, or like what part of like how much movement and there is in each piece.
Yeah. I would say the movement kind of taps back into like that narrative of like I'm moving in and out of different worlds. Like I'm moving into younger self and like current self back and forth, like taking remnants as I go, and kind of like I kind of look at these works in some instance too as like portals. Like that movement is like in there, like we're like going into different worlds and seeing what we can find, and bringing it back here. So for me, like that movement is symbolized like through that idea.
I love that. Thank you for that question, because then that brought back this idea of showing us different worlds, or taking it, this idea of some of these pieces as a portal.
Right.
I think is really interesting.
Yeah, like the death of color is like taking place around us everywhere we go. Like the way in which like something as simple as gentrification, like we see like the lack of color, the lack of identity, and seeing it like even throughout our fashion. I know I'm like all in neutrals right now, but like we see it in like the day to day. Like color is like slowly dying because we look at color like culturally. We think of it as tacky in some aspect, like when we have it in the home, or as a form of like in ways which we symbolize culture. Like the peak of like architecture in today's sense is like that sort of stone marble, like smooth white, minimal amount of color, and we see that as like the creme de la creme of design, when really that's just like the creme de la creme of like European design, and we are expected to take that as the standard. So for me, I also see color as like a pushing back of like what is what we consider like higher art as well too, whether it's in like our spaces or within our like museums as well, what the artwork is. So in that sense too, like I think about color as a way to revolt, because of how when we think about colors like identities that are colorful in nature, we think of most of those like identities coming from the global south. And then when we think about color in the north, global north, it's very void of that, because it's seen again as like tacky, or it's difficult to sort of design around, and that's not the case. Even the way in which we kind of like for instance, how like even with immigrants, many of us kind of bring with us what we got, whether they're like meant to match within our space, like the new space or not, and like we reduce those to like words like crafts or like tchotchkes or something like that, and it's like, but these are part of our identity. Why would I throw away these colors that have symbol to me, that have symbolism to me, these objects that have symbolism to me, and that have meaning that goes far deeper than like what the West, and how, in a sense, like the West has like imperialized color too, you know?
I'm also thinking of it in terms of capitalist context
Yeah.
as well. You know, in a space that you want to keep everything beige or bland,
Right.
so you can
Sell it
again.
back, yeah.
Yeah, so that, and then thinking about gender, but I'm sorry, I thought I heard someone say something, I'm like, yeah, what?
Laughing.
Yeah. So then that's interesting, because you know, there are some ways in which people might walk into the space and see this work as beautiful, and then say, you know, okay, it's just abstract, it's not
Right.
political, right?
Right.
But it sounds like you're saying, no, there is also some way that you're engaging with these bigger questions of
Right.
Oppressive systems, and an interest in kind of I guess erasing color, erasing beauty and joy,
Right.
and complexity from the diversity of U.S. culture.
Right.
And you're pushing against that. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I would say so, because this is also really inspired too from like conversations I have in like my color theory class.
Okay.
One of the first questions I ask my students is like, why you're taking this course. Most of them will say it because it's a requirement, but a lot of people will say too, because I don't know how to work with color. Like that is a really intense, like profound statement. Like you don't know how to work with color, which speaks a lot to like the education system in which you work within. Like it too is very dated if it's missing like color exploration. And they too have been told like the standard is like hyper real in charcoal or in graphite. Don't use colored pencil. Watercolor isn't a serious medium, so on and so forth. So to hear that speaks a lot to like the way in which we address color within like the K through 12 system too. That it's a thing of excess, and it's not going to be useful in the future for you to be a productive member of society.
So if we're thinking about the way that your show then is engaging with what some people might deem excessive,
Right.
or decorative, as you've already said, all of these these words that are used to say this stuff is not as important as these things.
Yeah.
You're intentionally saying no, but this is actually where all of the
Right.
the
This is where the
succulent
juice is. Yeah,
lies.
this is where the juice is. Yeah, I've definitely gone from like a younger self that was like a hard minimalist, and now I'm like, no, I understand the joy of maximalism now. I totally get it. Like, let me be a maximalist until I die. Like, let me die in excess of color. Why not?
Although we might say that, you know, the some minimalists would also really find a lot. I mean, you mentioned Agnes Martin,
Yeah.
and even though, you know, she wasn't using color all the time in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
way, I can totally see that connection.
Yeah.
You know, with her work and her interest in like thinking about space and grid,
Yeah.
and how the viewer's body is impacted by the work, which I really think in this show it is. At least for me, when I'm standing in front of the work, I'm like feeling the energy.
Yeah.
Feeling those portals that you were talking about. Any other questions from the audience? I also don't know how long we've been talking. I could honestly talk
We
to
do
you
this
for
all
like
day.
4 hours, so just fair warning, folks.
More of a comment. I appreciate how, the lens of research that you have that is social and political, but you're also putting yourself into it, but then also allowing intuitive reasoning to become a part of it, and not just letting, if you're asking yourself questions, but you're not letting them squash your decision making, and following your intuition, which leads you down to other discovery.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of came up in little bits and pieces, but
Yeah.
I really love that you didn't talk yourself in a circle and not do anything. And
Right.
You kept those questions in mind, but just said, fuck it, I'm
Yeah.
gonna do this thing. Yeah.
It's like, good question, moving on now. It's like when a student asks like that question you don't have the answer to, like, yeah, if you just do a quick Google review, moving on. Those are the questions for my therapist.
I love that though too, because then it also like gets to the reality that when we were kids, we sort of did these things intuitively, and we weren't
Yeah.
judging ourselves or stopping ourselves necessarily in the same way.
And
that we
intuition is a
learned.
very gendered thing in our society too.
Yeah.
We always reduce it to like the woman, the female body, and we also look at it as void of logic and reasoning, therefore it must not be a serious answer. But I'm like, far from that. If anything, tuition is like the divine seed. Like, it's telling you to do something. Like, is tuition always right? No. But it's onto something usually. It's like telling you to tap in. Like, there's something, like there's a well, you need to like get your water, you know? So I'm glad that like you caught that as well. Cause like, even throughout my art career, like I've never stuck to like a single medium. I've just been like, okay, cool, now we get to move on to the next thing. Like, what's the thing that's like, again, gonna make me feel like excited like a kid again, like, ooh, I'm learning something new, like this is fun. Like, that's really always been the driving force for like, what's the next medium, and how I can connect it back to the story. So yeah. Kind
So
of going,
the,
yeah.
the message is have fun.
Right, for the
Lean
love of
into
God,
the
have
joy.
some fun, the world is simply on fire, nothing is serious, Elon isn't real, go live, please.
Well, it is making me think a lot about discourses around rest and taking care of yourself, and in this context where the world is on fire, there are so many heartbreaking and heavy things and pain and suffering that so many people are experiencing, and it seems like your work is also saying in that reality to engage with that critically, to do something.
Yeah.
It's also necessary to be present with yourself.
Right.
I don't know if you can
Totally. I think sometimes we definitely get trapped in trauma and trapped into like the cycle of like, for lack of a better term, like how do I put it? Into the cycle of like oppression porn and like trauma porn in America, like just through war and imperialism as well too. Like, we feel like this is the only way in which we can conduct ourselves, and I think to myself too, like, you need to step away from that, because like it will consume you. It really will take away so much from you. And I want to say it was like Angela Davis who spoke on like the importance of rest, and like in order for a revolution to take place, you have to rest. Like, you need to have your body prepared for that thing that your community will need, or like for what the world needs of you, and that can't be done while your glass is empty. So, in the midst of it all, like, as much like atrocity that's taking place in the world, we have to like dial back. And I think too, we feel this pressure because with social media, we're like, I have to prove that I give a shit about this thing, so I have to put it on my story as proof that I really care about it, you know? Like, we're all sort of like victim to that, and it's like, we can care about these things without having to use these like tools to show that we care. There are other ways in which we can express care without always being consumed within the trauma that is caused by like these atrocities. Yeah.
maybe more meaningful ways
Right,
than
'cause-
posting on Instagram.
Right, but also
Yeah.
too, it kind of goes back to like this expectation, I think from a lot of, at least like from like brown artists, and I've heard this too from like black artists as well, like this pressure to always tap into like stories of trauma in order for the work to be validated through a white Western lens. And that's wholly unfair, that like, again, going back, like, why can't I show joy as someone in this body? Why is that only reserved for like white people to make this type of work? Like, we have that too. We find ways in which we can be resilient and express our joy in the midst of like what is around us, even if the world is like collapsing, you know? So, it kind of like makes me think too about like the history of like Lebanese people, like just to this day always waiting for like that next bomb to drop, but they're like, yeah, like inflation is like at an all-time high, like we're out of like all of these necessary like resources, but at the end, like we're gonna go out at night, we're gonna go like have a good time, because like the world could end at like any moment, because like the history of Lebanese people, at least within the last like 50 years, has been that. It's like they've seen their world end, but they've rebuilt it. And in the way they knew they couldn't rebuild it without having aspects of joy within it.
I bet, you know, that's like the 5th time in our conversation that you brought tears to my eyes.
Oh, man.
And it also, I think, kind of comes back to this idea that your work is still deeply connected to your multiple identities, to your family's past in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Even if it's not engaging with that past in a way that your grad program or art historians can say, oh, I get that.
Right.
You know, I
Yeah.
think that's really beautiful and subversive and joyful.
Yeah. Like, let me have my fun too, you know?
In whatever way you want.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. Can we clap for you?
Appreciate it, y'all. No,
Thank you,
I
that was
really-
amazing.
Thank you,
Yeah.
appreciate it. I hope I made sense.
Yeah.
The gendered urge to be like, did that make sense after something you said made total sense?
I know what you mean.